Welcome to the Born Free podcast, where we'll discuss the challenges facing the world's wildlife and ecosystems. My name's Sarah Locke, and I'll be talking to the passionate people doing their bit to try and secure a future where wildlife and humans can peacefully coexist. So today we're joined by Dr Nikki Tagg, Conservation Programmes Manager at Born Free Foundation. Thanks for joining, Nikki.
Thank you for having me.
So do you want to just start with, you've been at Born Free now for just over a year, and do you want to just tell us a little bit about exactly what you've been up to?
Okay, yeah, well, I joined just over a year ago as a Conservation Programmes Manager, so I support the Head of Conservation in sort of managing and delivering our conservation portfolio. So I've been focusing quite a lot, I guess, of my time on conservation strategy. So developing a conservation strategy is basically about, first of all, identifying what your biodiversity or ecological targets are. So, for example, a population of tigers. And then identifying which threats they're facing and then which behaviours and other factors are contributing to those threats. And that gives you your situation analysis or your threats analysis. And then the next step of a strategy is looking at, well, what can we do? What work packages can we deliver to change these behaviours and change the situation to improve your target by reducing the threats that they face? So that's your conservation strategy. And that's one thing that I've been looking at across the board in our Tier 1 programmes mainly, and in particular for our Central Indian tiger conservation programme.
Okay, great. That sounds really kind of like all-encompassing, I guess, in terms of Born Free's work. And obviously you mentioned tigers there, but you actually had your history isn't based in India, is it? Sorry, you've mainly worked in Africa before, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I did a zoology degree and then a PhD in evolutionary ecology, which is more of a fundamental discipline and sort of looking at how ecology evolved. And I did quite a lot of field work through my studies in Canada and Kenya as well, and the New Forest. But it wasn't until I graduated that I sort of got out properly into the wilderness of Africa and spent several years volunteering or working for a stipend on mainly great ape conservation and research projects, so chimpanzees and gorillas in Central Africa.
Oh, wow.
So I worked in Gabon, both Congos, various places. So in 2007, I took up the position of scientific supervisor for a great ape research and conservation project. And the idea of that project was that it was actually sort of funded by a research council in Belgium. And so therefore its scientific output was the important thing. So we ran a research program in the forest and then had an agreement with local communities that they wouldn't hunt in these forests in return for anything we could provide them. So we carried out sort of small-scale development initiatives with them, conservation education programs, cocoa farming, anything that they identified a need for. And then we would bring students or invite researchers from across the world to carry out their studies in this area. So my background really has been in sort of great ape research until now.
Oh, wow. And is that still continuing? Because I know that you manage a project, don't you, in Cameroon. Is that the same one?
Yeah, so that project's still going and I'm remotely managing it, yes.
Oh,
yeah.
amazing. And what's that called, sorry?
It's Projet Grand Singe, so Great Ape Project in French.
Okay, cool. Thanks, just for those that didn't do A-level. Okay, so that's amazing. So really, really broad then. And how have you found then the jump from working remotely and managing a project as opposed to you being there and being able to, if you have issues and you can deal with those when you're there? How have you found the leap?
Yeah, it is very different. I think it really helps to have spent time actually working on the front line in the field because you understand the realities of it. Although, to be honest, in my experience, I've been, although based perhaps in Cameroon for many years, I was often in the city anyway and working on a lot of the admin or the building relationships, a lot of working with authorities, that kind of thing. The main difference I've found and the reason that I came to Born Free, to be honest, was because I was finding that although I loved the research I was doing and I loved running a research program, I was finding that working for a sort of research-focused institute meant that the work I was doing wasn't actually contributing towards making any difference. So, we were producing papers which were clearly explaining why chimpanzees and gorillas were declining in number, but apart from being read by a few people in the conservation community, they weren't going any further than that.
That's
So
such an important point,
yeah.
and actually something that I really think that you're not the only person thinking that. I think that's something that I really hear quite often about people is it's all well and good you producing papers, but at the end of the day, people, you got into this because you want to make tangible benefits for wildlife, and I think that's definitely something that is kind of a changing movement, which is great. Which is really great.
Yeah, and working here in Born Free, that there's policy, there's education, there's communications, there's marketing, all under the same roof, working for the same goal. So that was one of the main reasons for taking that sort of move away from research and into conservation sort of.
So did you see some kind of positive steps in your project in Cameroon?
Yeah, so the model works on a kind of localized scale, but the problem is that it's not as yet sustainable.
Okay.
The local people still rely on the sort of the casual labour that we can offer them, and the development initiatives that we can offer them, and also a lot of what you can offer them in that situation doesn't always replace hunting. So often these what we call alternative livelihoods can actually be supplementary livelihoods, and people, because they need to, are continuing to hunt.
Yeah, of course. That's something, isn't it? Is that I guess ultimately when you're faced with the choice of legal or illegal activity, and the illegal activity is always going to benefit you far greater, how can we ask people to choose? I guess that's something that we need to
run these programs alongside sort of law enforcement efforts, and sadly that's a big issue in Central Africa. The enforcement just isn't there.
No, I can imagine. So we just touched on briefly also the tiger work that Born Free is doing in India, and I know that you're actually preparing for a trip for India at the moment. What are you up to there?
So our program is called Satpuda Landscape Tiger Partnership, SLTP for short, and every year we run a seminar. So this year I'll be attending the seminar that's happening next week.
And is this the first one that you've gone to?
It's the first seminar I've attended. It'll be my second trip to the programme. But this will be really nice because I'll have the opportunity to listen to all of the partners taking it in turns to present their work. So the SLTP works around a network of Indian NGOs, which Born Free supports on the ground. So this seminar will give them the opportunity to talk, give us updates from the field, and also for us to think about strategy of the programme.
Okay.
As I mentioned, going forward, the vision over the next few years.
So can you tell us a little bit about the project on the ground? Kind of like what kind of area are we talking? Is it 9 NGOs? Is that right? Or maybe they're not all NGOs actually. 8 or 9?
I think it's 7, but we do have another one joining. So yeah, it's a huge program. Geographically, it's a massive scope. We're talking Satpuda Landscape is in central India. So at the moment, we have partners working in 7 tiger reserves in that area. But the scope of central India is a lot bigger. And I think there's a potential for something like 20,000 kilometres squared of tiger habitat within central India. And those are just the sort of protected areas. As I mentioned, tigers also need to be able to sort of move between tiger reserves. So they're really a species which can't survive into the long run just if we protect a scattering of protected areas across the country. We need to make sure that they have corridors so that they can find mates, find resources they need, and disperse throughout the landscape. So really the key sort of aim of the SLTP program is that we're trying to help people and tigers to be able to live, to be able to sort of coexist across this huge landscape so that tigers aren't persecuted while they're moving in between reserves.
And just to kind of like get a scale within that huge landscape, how many tigers are we kind of talking about? And I guess are we talking about lots of large villages of people? Is that kind of the lay of the land?
Yeah, well, in terms of tigers, so the government do a survey every few years. So their latest survey of tiger numbers was in 2018, and their estimate India-wide is just under 3,000 tigers. And within central India, we don't have the breakdown of those figures by reserve, but it's possibly about 300, and that's just to give you
so that's quite a sizable
so it might actually be 800 across central India. I got the numbers wrong there. Yeah. That's just to give you a ballpark figure. We don't actually know the breakdown, but that's just to give you an idea of sort of the number of tigers. But within one reserve, it could be as few as 7 tigers. It could be maybe sort of 40, 45.
Forgive my ignorance. Are they territorial tigers?
Yes.
How does that work? So do males and females, do they overlap in theirs, or are theirs quite segmented as well?
I believe there's overlap. I don't know a lot about the ecology of the tiger, to be honest. I'm learning. But I know that they have huge territories. They can range, it depends really on sort of the density of resources, but it can range up to sort of several hundred kilometres squared for the territory of one tiger.
So what are the main threats for the tigers in the area then? Is it conflict? I mean, I know that we hear about and we see often the awful trade in tiger skins and things like that, and things like their bones becoming more popular in Chinese medicines. But is that an issue in these parts, or is it kind of like conflict?
That is an issue. Yeah, there is tiger poaching going on, but what we deal with through the SLTP is more community level conservation and community level threats that the tigers are being faced with. So really it's conflict, it's human wildlife conflict. And there's many different sort of types of conflict. Really it's just about negative interactions between wildlife and people. So we can consider when a tiger kills livestock, or when a tiger or another animal injures somebody or damages crops. And then we can also look at the reverse. So when people kill wildlife for whatever reason, or if they retaliate and kill a tiger. So all those types of things are different types of interactions, and that's the main threat really in this kind of on this landscape level for tigers.
And how common is that? I know it sounds like a stupid question, but it's quite hard to fathom, sort of from the other side of the world. How often does this happen? How often does a tiger kind of stroll into a village?
I imagine for any one village that's quite rare, but we know that tigers and leopards do take cattle on a regular basis, and certainly other wildlife damaging crops, for example, is going to be more common than an encounter with a rare tiger. But it's a daily occurrence, conflict with wildlife for people living rurally in India.
And what kind of support do people get from, or if any, from governments? Do they have things like compensation schemes?
They do, yeah. I think a lot of the problem with those is that people don't often know, or they don't know how to sort of tap into the compensation that's available, or the process might be really slow or difficult, or perhaps rigorous, so that people don't actually receive anything in the end.
So is there sort of an outreach element as part of the network strategies to kind of to allow people to understand, are there kind of like points of contact within the network that people can go to if they have an issue with a tiger?
Yeah, definitely. Different partners deal with it different ways, but one of the things that Born Free wants to focus on more in the Satpuda landscape is mitigating or reducing conflict, or helping people cope with conflict, because you can't always stop conflict completely, but you can help people deal with it so that it's less of a negative, less of a problem for them. So one way is by making sure there's a primary response team available who can be there whenever, if you report that your cattle has been killed by a tiger, for example. And I went along to an encounter like that when I was in India last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and just help calm down the person, take their details, facilitate the process of applying for compensation, and what other measures that we need to put into place to make sure that they don't then retaliate against the tiger.
So what had happened in that incident? Was it livestock predation, or?
Yeah, it was a cow that had been taken by a tiger early that morning, I think. So we went along, and what this partner did was set up camera traps because often the tiger would come back later on, and that's what happened. And they could even identify the individual tiger that came back to retrieve the carcass.
So are there issues with that in terms of identifying an individual? Because then do the community then kind of see that as like a problem animal that needs to be removed? What are steps taken to do that, to relocate? Because you often see that as I guess that's one of the foremost things that people do ask for. But in terms of like a conservation, that's quite logistically quite difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think they set the camera traps in order to identify the animal. It's also just to check that it was a tiger, or maybe it was a leopard,
I see, okay.
For example. But also I think the identification of the individuals is not something that they then share with the local people. It's not in order to identify any tiger as a problem tiger. That's relocating a tiger, is not something that we would be involved with, and it's not always the ideal solution.
No, sure. And have people's attitudes changed since SLTP was set up? Like, do you think that people have become a bit more tolerant? Do you think it has helped kind of the situation in India, in central India?
Well, we certainly hope so. So one thing that we're working more on now is actually monitoring and evaluation of our programs across Born Free. And as I mentioned with SLTP, that's something that we'll be talking about at the seminar that I'm going to. So you can use research to guide your conservation, but you can also use it to evaluate your conservation. So, for example, we might be carrying out particular interventions in the field, but we need to know, are they working? Are we doing the right thing? We might be, for example, providing, like we would in Kenya, we're building, corralling livestock at night to keep them safe. Is that intervention actually having the effect we want? We might be helping people claim compensation in India, but is it actually improving people's tolerance or not? And then is that having an effect on conflict? Is it reducing conflict? So we can't know that unless we do some monitoring and evaluation. So that's something we're working with the partners with. And a lot of the time it's very simple research. It's not all about complicated experiments.
No, of course.
Often it's as simple as sitting together with a focus group, youths, women, farmers, and talking about their understanding or their attitudes, or it might be about doing slightly more rigorous surveys and actually recording people's perceptions or that kind of thing. So that's definitely something we need to find out. Is our work actually making a difference? Yeah.
And is this something that you've seen sort of this kind of network? Because it sounds like quite a unique strategy, I think, and maybe more, but I've not kind of heard of similar sort of networks in India anyway. Do you think it's quite a novel concept? Have you seen it elsewhere?
Not really. I think it is quite a unique concept. I think the normal format for conservation is that there are hundreds of NGOs all working independently on the ground, and it's so important to share information and work together to have a much bigger sort of impact. So that's what SLTP does. It gives you that extra impact.
Again, I kind of think that's something in conservation that sort of or is way more of a movement now, is kind of like, actually we need to be working in unison. We all want the same thing, don't we? And I quite like this project because it does have it has the human development aspect so at its core, as well as the kind of the conservation objectives. So what are the next steps for SLTP? If you're looking at a 5-year 10-year strategy, do they want to make the network bigger? Are they looking for more partners, or are you just looking to kind of, I guess you're, as you said, you're definitely looking to increase the evaluation and monitoring approach of the project?
Yeah, I think the network's always open to more partners. There are a lot of other NGOs and institutions in India doing great work who could contribute to the work that SLTP is doing. So I think they're always open to that. I think for me, the important thing is that we want to see the partners working more coherently together in the future. And so at project level, each of the partners is doing quite well at sort of starting to monitor their own outcomes. So if we've got a conservation education program run in a few schools, it's quite straightforward to sort of monitor what impact that's having on the children in those schools. Mm-hmm. But it's at program level across the landscape that we need to work out ways to monitor what effect we're having. And like I mentioned, the government does tiger monitoring every few years. So that's not the kind of thing that I'm talking about that we need to do. But somehow we need to kind of be measuring the impact on conflict. Are we reducing conflict across the landscape? Are we improving people's tolerance towards tigers? Are we helping promote coexistence? That kind of thing. So I think that's the direction we need to be moving in with SLTP over the next few years. Especially
if tiger numbers are growing, which is great. And I actually just wanted to touch on, what is the kind of the space for those tiger populations to grow? Now that's quite a big question, but do you have any kind of concept of how, what is the kind of, I don't want to say carrying capacity, but how much room is there to grow for their populations in India?
I think there's still room. I don't know the numbers. I very much doubt that it's at carrying capacity. The problem, of course, is that a lot of the land is used for other things now, for settlements or for agriculture, for pastoralism. So it's difficult now. But across central India, I have an idea that all the tiger reserves make up roughly 20,000 kilometres squared of tiger habitat, I believe. So if we were to extend our activities, a bit more widely within Central Africa, that's a big sort of landscape for tigers available there.
No, absolutely. Wow. So what are the kind of the other key? I know we talk about the overarching goals for the project, but this in terms of the breakdown of the kind of the social benefits, and we spoke about a few of the educational outreach programs. There's also things like mobile health units. Is that right? Do you work on water initiatives?
Yeah, so there's lots of different projects on the ground that the partners are involved with. I suppose what we can sort of group our initiatives into those which deal with reducing conflict or helping people cope with conflict, or maybe reducing people's dependency on forest resources. So a lot of conflict between wildlife and people is when people are going into the forest to gather firewood, for example, or to gather other forest products. So there's a particular flower that at a particular time of the year, everyone in India from daybreak is out collecting because they make a liquor or they make pickles with it. And that's often where, a tiger, for example, might mistake a child bent double picking up flowers as prey, and that's where conflict can occur. So if there are ways that we can reduce people's dependency on these resources in the forest and have them in the forest less, and it's also about gathering water. Wildlife and people both access water sources in the forest as well. So a lot of the initiatives are around that. And then, of course, conservation awareness and conservation education programs are very important within the program.
Okay, so what are the kind of alternative livelihood options? Maybe you don't know off the top of your head, but the kind of alternative livelihood options that you're looking into to kind of help mitigate that resource use?
Well, it can vary. It can be sort of help setting up micro enterprises. So maybe, women having small restaurants. I visited one like that had been sort of set up with aid from a partner. That they do a lot of careers training, some of the partners on the ground as well, just helping people know what's available and helping them to sort of access what's available. So perhaps working in the tourism industry or you're working as a mechanic, but there are many sort of different sort of skill sets available.
Yes, it's really different, I guess. I suppose I wouldn't have really thought of like a mechanic as like an alternative livelihood. That's a stupid thing to say, but I guess you don't if you're in, if you're living in such a rural area that's just not at the forefront of. So that's amazing that's really having that kind of change. That's great. Okay, well, thanks so much, Nikki. I mean, it's been really great to talk to you, and I can't wait to hear about your trip and to find out more about the project when you return. Thank you
very much.
Thank you for listening to the Born Free podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch the episodes, follow us on social media, or head to our website, bornfree.org.uk. My name's Sarah Locke, and our producer's Philip Fortuna. See you next time.